Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. This is, I'm also in a different space. I'm quite used to hosting the public lecture series, but this is a more fun, a more intellectual, perhaps more design-oriented conversation. I thought we should just keep it as informal as possible. So bring coffee, beverage of choice, whatever you want. Just keep your audio on mute if you could, please. That's the only request we have initially. But on behalf of the campus and the archives, welcome to the launch of the archives logo. This has been work in progress, Anupa, I don't know for how long, but to give a little more context to some of the conversations here, for those of you who are new to this, who are coming into this because of your interest in design, maybe I should just set some context here. The Archives at NCBS is a public collecting center for the history of contemporary biology in India. It opened in 2019, early 2019. And it has, I would say, maybe one broad philosophy, which is to enable a diversity of stories, and three broad objectives, which is to think of strengthening the commons, using the archives as a way to strengthen the commons, sort of spearheading education through archival awareness, and also to work as part of a collective called MILI, which is a way to find, tell, and share stories and really nurture archives big and small wherever they might be. So we're very happy to be part of the collective as well. The archive, as I just mentioned, it's only been a few years around, and a year and a half of that has been in a pandemic. So our ability to actually host everyone in person has been limited, but we've been having ideas of the logo. We started these ideas in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, initially. And we tested some of these ideas out, and it didn't quite gel at the time, and the archive wasn't quite open. And then we sort of continuously been thinking about this. And then one of our colleagues on campus, who wishes to continue to remain unnamed, but she's been phenomenal in the way she's been thinking about the logo. And so she and the archives worked on initial ideas for the logo, thinking of the concept of the logo. And she's been quite tireless about this effort for about a year, or maybe more than a year. And then sometime in between the pandemic, we thought, we felt it was time to sort of really start thinking about branding and identity of the archive. Knowing fully well that the logo itself can't do everything. The logo is, the logo can only be as strong as the brand itself. And so there's a certain symbiotic relation, but we thought, let's start working in this direction. And at that point, we thought we should, we were looking around, and we could think of no one better than Anupa to reach out to at the time. And we were very grateful that she agreed to work on this project. So what I'm going to do is, so this project has been something that she's been working on for many months, and she'll tell you about it. But as we decided to think of launching this logo, all the things that we've done in the archive have always had a historical context to it. And we thought, how do we go about launching the logo? Do we just want to have an event? We thought it probably just makes most sense to reach out to someone who's been thinking about logos for a very long time and has worked on it extensively. And again, in this situation, we're very grateful that Tarun agreed to be part of this conversation, to give us this broader historical perspective on the history and a visual analysis of institutional logos in India. So I will shut up for the rest of this conversation till the Q&A. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anupa. So I'll start with Anupa's introduction. Anupa is a brand and design consultant based in Bangalore. She works on branding, print, packaging design projects, as well as UI UX design projects for digital products. In addition to her independent practice, she supports the team at the hard copy in the capacity of a design consultant, and is also a partner creative lead at Kula, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
A design for education initiative. And she's also led the development of the logo for the Archives at NCBS, which you'll hear about very soon. Tarundeep Girdhar is the principal designer in the graphic design discipline at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. He has more than 20 years of consolidated experience in design education, professional design practice, and academic governance. At NID, he teaches type design, typography, printing technology, illustration, visual narratives, and environmental perception. And he's currently working on a book on the history of institutional logos in India. We're very grateful to both of them for being here, and I look forward to hearing from Anupa and then Tarun. Anupa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venkat. Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. So, okay, here we go. So earlier this year, I was commissioned to design the new logo for the archives at the NCBS. And so I'll be using this session to showcase the work that went into creating the logo. And I think one of the biggest reason why we wanted to do it because as the audience of the archives at NCBS, it's important to share this process with you, and because you're as much a part of the institution as like everybody else who's part of the archives. Um, and so I'm going to step right into my presentation. I've divided it into three parts. So the first bit is going to be the starting of any design process, which is it starts with a brief essentially. So we look at how the brief was broken down, and I like to call that bit the investigation. And then I'm going to look at how the brief was used to come up with various like logo options and ideas, and I'm going to call the section construction. And lastly, like we came up with logos that we were quite happy about, but we wanted this kind of approval from people who are closely associated with the archives. And so we're going to use that as this idea called affirmation, because we want to sort of build this kind of ownership towards the logo through that process. So one of the first things to that comes to mind when it comes to like designing for an institution is this idea that the identity of an institution is sacred. And it's a rather bold thing to say, and but there's a reason why I'm saying it. It's because like I believe like when you compare an institution to any commercial enterprise, it's a lot more sacred, because in the case of a commercial enterprise, be it a company or a product brand, like a lot of the decision around identity is based on the economic landscape. And however, like the identity for an institution, especially the archives, it's reflective of the community that builds it and engages with it. So it's a lot like giving a visual identity to, an ideology or of a place, of belonging, of something that's familiar, because in that scenario, like the idea of identity is a lot more personal. It can be a reflection of who you are, your beliefs as an audience member of this archives or a curator of the archives. So how do you design for something with a very strong emotional quotient? And that's one of the first questions that arises when you're trying to design for an institution. So I typically work with corporate brands and consumer product brands. And in all of those scenarios, your primary audience, like in the case of a corporate brand, it's usually the employees, the management, and their clients. It's not necessarily like the general public. In the case of a consumer brand setting, it's the consumer, and the consumer who would want to buy into a product or buy into the values associated with a product. But at the end of the day, a lot of times these values are manufactured, they're artificially constructed, whereas for an archives or an institution, the values are present even before its conception. And so there is this question of commerce versus culture that comes into play. But in the case of an archives, the culture kind of supersedes the commerce angle of things. And I'd like to illustrate this with a fairly uh, simple example. Like these are four logos that everyone here are familiar with. And on the left side, I've put the Tatas and the Infosys because they are these huge corporate houses, which, for who, like if they were to change their identity, and which I think Tatas did in the 90s, like it, if you're an employee or, a client of theirs, you might be like critical of it, but it doesn't really affect your life so much. It doesn't become an identifier of who you are. Whereas, like, say, if you were an avid listener of All India Radio, or a viewer of Doordarshan, this is something that um, it's a lot more important to you. If they were to change the logo, you do have an opinion about it, because there's a cultural value associated with those brands, and they could be a reflection of, or they are a reflection of who you are, because you are a viewer or a listener of those brands. And in fact, with Doordarshan, it so happened that in 2017 they had a logo design competition, which they just put it out there. It was like a crowdsourced effort, and they shortlisted 5 logos that they had put out in 2019. And there was a huge backlash on that. Like there were people who were super upset about the fact that the old logo was changing, because they were so attached to the old logo. And they had to come out with a statement saying that there was just a competition, that they had no plans to really change their logo. So when you're designing for an institution or an entity like the archives, the emotion that run with it is kind of similar. So where do we begin in a process like that? So in the case of an archives, it started with a brief, like it's the case with any design project. And so the brief that I received was a fairly comprehensive one. And like Venkat just said in the introduction, they've been thinking about it for a very, very long time in terms of how to articulate the story of the archive. So by the time I stepped in, I had a very solid foundation to work from. The brief that they gave me was this, and it reads as follows. The archives at NCBS is seen as a commons, a place to weave together a community of scientists, historians, other storytellers, such as journalists, playwrights, and so on, along with the public. It is a trusted preserver of historical material in science, a crucible for education across discipline. In general, a new logo should address ideas around archives, community, interconnectivity, network, story, along with an element of biology or science. So this might look like a very short brief, but it's fairly deep, very well articulated. It knew its audience, it knew its purpose of existence, the features that it wanted to showcase. And to have this clarity from the beginning really helps to visualize. So as with any design project, the first thing that we did was deconstruct this brief, look at it from various angles to see what is the best way to go, to take it forward. And so when I began doing that, like the four words kind of stood out for me from the brief, and these were memory, connection, science, and narrative. And the reason is that memory is quite easy because at the end of the day, it's a preserver of historical material. So it's almost like it keeps these memories, in its whole. And then it makes connections using these memories. And from those connections, there are new narratives that are built. So there's this idea of narrative that come. And then it's also an institution that was conceived at a science research institution. So there is that aspect of science that comes into play, and as well as the fact that majority of the material that it holds is from a scientific sort of space. So I began using these words and then started working on concepts for the archives, and the concept needed to have like fairly tangible form. So I'm going to take you through what those concepts were and how they were visualized. So one of the first things that we thought about uh, was inspired by the idea of tree of life, Darwin's tree of life, where it says that evolution is possible due to information retained within biological beings, which is a form of memory, and it could be translated to this idea of organic memory. So when we examine how nature is organized, one of the recurring patterns that occur is the Fibonacci sequence, which is also something that is like most people know what it means and how it looks. So it's present in many biological settings, like in the arrangement of leaves, in fruitlets of pineapple, in the unfurling of fern, even in pine cones. So anyone could understand where this is coming from. So it was an easy sort of metaphor to work from. So I chose one of the first route, which we call the organic memory. I chose the unfurling fern because to me it looked a lot like the lowercase a. And so we started off with, one of the early options was this, where we used that the Fibonacci idea to recreate the A for archives. But the feedback that we got, or in all the discussion, what came up was that this form is not unique enough, that it wasn't giving the archives a very distinct sort of a look. So then we parked this idea and then we moved on to look for others. So while I was researching about archives, I came across this line from a book called The Birth of the Archives. And the line reads as, archives are considered today to be a creative cultural technology that shapes memory, making it possible to write history while simultaneously shaping it. And I felt this idea of shaping memory was rather powerful, especially in our current post-truth world, to have that kind of authority where you can shape how you recollect historical information. And I thought that was a fairly important position for an archives to hold. And so in order to visualize this, um, I turned to this principle of gestalt, which is a visual technique that is highly dependent on memory, where you have to look at various forms in terms of how they come together and what meaning it holds when they come together. So it's similar to how puzzle pieces come together and reveals an idea or a story. And this is a visual technique that's frequently used in logos. Like one of the most famous examples is the FedEx logo, which has a arrow in between the E and the X, and it's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I thought I could use this kind of an idea for the archives, where a few random shapes could you know put start building the form of the uppercase A. And so this route was looked at quite favorably at the start. But the one of the problems this route has is that it starts to look very cold because of the sharp edges and those forms that are there in it. And it also reminds you a bit of like architectural forms. So this was one of the feedbacks that we got, and which was a relevant feedback. So then I tried to like soften the curves and try to make it more rounded, but it didn't really, cue the feeling that we wanted to convey through this identity. So again, like we parked this idea of like shaping memory and like moved on to the next thing. So like Venkat was saying before, the team at Archives have been working on ideas around identity even before I joined to assist. And one of the thoughts was around this idea of a symbol that can hold multiple meanings. And the way this started out is because they noticed that the ampersand and treble clef were constructed in the same sort of manner, yet their forms have like two different meaning depending on the context in which they exist. So we decided to retain the ampersand because it already suggested this idea of multiple narratives. And this also worked in line with one of the lines I picked up in a conversation with Venkat, which was an archive is a preserver and enabler of diverse stories. And to elaborate it further, it can take one thread of thought and weave it through many others, finding many connections, many perspectives, and newer ways of seeing. This process is ever continuous, accepting multiple narratives and diverse stories. So this idea of diverse stories kind of stuck with me. And even like more when I was looking into how like the folks who are from the archives, and from their interviews I came across this other aspect of the archives, of institutional archives, is the fact that STEM suffers from a lack of diversity, and hence it's hard for the institutional archives to document natural sciences. And but like the archives at NCBS is different in that regard, because it pushes for diversity, and this is one of the things that makes them unique. And so the idea of diverse stories kind of stuck with me. And because I thought it was a much more purposeful route, and it, gave archives a much more distinct sort of a look. And the resultant form is an A that's reconstructed in the form of an ampersand. And we went through like multiple rounds of iteration. And at one point, we felt that we need to contextualize it a little more and sort of, give a nod to South Indian scripts. So the final version that we were quite happy with is this. So this is what we went with finally, and which we felt was unique. It addressed the requirements of the brief fairly well. Um, Now the thing is, even though we reached this point, like one of the things we were very deliberate in during the logo process is to constantly check with the others, because it was just a few of us working on the main part of the logo. And we did have a review committee to oversee the work, but that wasn't enough. Like it was important to put it out there to a larger pool of people to sort of test out whether this is working, which is essentially a sample group of the potential audience of the archives, to test out whether we were heading in the right direction. So what we did in regard to like fixing that issue was that we decided to have a fair voting system. So we went for this ranked choice voting system where everyone could choose a logo based on their preference. And so the winner was always chosen based on the highest rank that a logo received. And so the final winner was the logo in the circle. It was this. And we use the same sort of method even for figuring out what color would work for this archives, because it was important for the archives to also sit alongside the Bangalore Life Science Cluster logo and the NCBS logo. And so we finally went with the brown because it complemented the greens really well and the yellows. So this is the final logo that we went with. This is the new logo of archives at NCBS. And so it is a process that we did, we were quite deliberately like doing it quite slowly because we wanted to be very sure about what we were, the result that we were looking for. And so yeah, this is it. And these were some extra applications that I did just to check whether the logo was working in various other contexts. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. And over to you, Tarun.
Well,
Tarun,
I'm a little overwhelmed, because it was
No
so
chance.
it was so delightful to when you walked us through your entire process, and I can imagine how many situations there would have been sort of a you know what you have envisioned and visualized as the logo versus everybody else's visual preferences and choices. But wonderful, heartiest congratulations, Anupa, to you
Thank you.
and Venkat
Thank
and
you.
everybody else at the archives and NCBS and BLISC. So, is it my turn now? Yeah,
Yes,
Venkat.
very much.
Okay. So I'm glad that Venkat, sort of ticked off the formal this thing. So I would just want to have more of a conversation and sort of share my observations on this is. So thank you so much, NCBS team, for having me here. Such kind of conversations really, um, help us to take a pause from our daily drill as an academician and as an administrator, and sort of take a pause and reflect back upon what the hell is happening in this domain, right? So I'm going to quickly start sharing my screen. Just give me a moment. Okay, so this popped up. Okay. Um, are you guys able to see the first slide on your screen, or is PDF again acting hanky panky? Is it a black screen you guys are
No,
seeing,
no, it's
or?
fine. It's fine. I can
Okay,
see it.
okay. So wonderful. So I think broadly the topic of my conversation today is looking at logos of institutions or institutes in our country, and little bit of history, but more of a visual analysis. I'll begin with a disclaimer. I am not an historian. I am more of a doer. I am not a researcher. I am more of a practitioner. So it was actually quite an insightful journey for me also to put together what I'm going to share now. But before we begin, I think I'll start with sharing some basic terminology so that we are all on the same page when I'm going to run through the other slides. Because in our profession we've realized that a lot of these terms are used interchangeably and often uh, not in the right place. So let me start with what is a logotype. In some countries it is also known as a word mark. In some countries it is also known as a letter mark uh, or a trademark. But essentially, logotype or a word mark is largely a typography based visual identity or a symbol, which is used as a symbol for any entity. It could be an organization, it could be an institution, it could be a commercial venture. But essentially, it uses the name or the initial alphabets of the organization's name, and the examples are quite popular. The more recent one was when Vodafone and India sort of merged together, and obviously they wanted a new identity. So that story is up there on the web. For those of you guys who are interested, can always look up. But essentially, What makes a symbol fall into the category of a logotype or a word mark is because it uses recognizable alphabets or letter forms, irrespective of the language. The examples on the screen which you see are all using the English letter forms, but we have many examples which are using local letter forms, Indic letter forms, and things like that. Largely, this is used by organizations where they prefer to be known as their acronyms, like FedEx, IBM, L&T, for example, things like that. The next category is what we call visual abstraction, right? Now, this one is slightly more illustrative in its forms. It may or may not use alphabets, but largely it uses recognizable images or abstract manifestation of those objects. So, Apple is, of course, a very popular one. United Nations, we are all able to recognize the continents and the club leaves. So, those kind of images are combined together to form a visual. Operation Flood has been around for a couple of decades now, but if one looks closer, one can look within the drop. One can also recognize the shape of a tumbler out of which milk is being poured. This central portion. So that is where the visual abstraction comes in. And the Right to Information Act, it does look like a paper, or when we use any layout software, and we zoom out a little, we are able to see those gray lines and things like that. The third category is what is known as a combination mark. And in this one, very consciously, the design agency or the design team designs the what we also call lockup or the master identity, where it is a combination of alphabets or words and the visual component. So some very classic and popular examples are the Aadhaar. So it is never going to be used without these letter forms. Or State Bank of India, this has been revamped now. Their entire identity process has been revamped, rationalized in a very, very consistent manner. Life Insurance of Corporation, of course, and from the government perspective, when we look at this e-marketplace, some of you guys may be aware about the e-tendering process and things like that. So there are these three broad categories of symbols which we look at, right? So moving on to the main topic, I said, okay, when we look at the logos of institutions, for the sake of keeping this conversation a little simple and easy to understand, I focused, or rather, I stuck to looking at and examining logos of academic institutions for today's conversation. Some of the examples, actually most of the examples which I'm going to share with you to carry this conversation would be academic institutions or institutions of higher education, but there are some other examples also, right? So let me begin with institutions which have been around in our country even before the independence kind of a thing. So University of Calcutta, some of you guys may be aware, was established in 1857, and the one which you see on the left was their initial logo, and it of course went through certain kind of changes or refinement in terms of the form. I don't have any concrete evidence, but my calculated assumption and understanding is that if you pay attention to this flower and what is being currently used, the flower is different, but the basic notion is the same. Like there are these solar flares, and inside which there is a flower and these circles, and then there are another 9 circles inside, and the way the typography is arranged. These kind of modifications or slight modifications in the form and shape of the logo is a very, very acceptable process, because it was influenced largely by the way the technology evolved, right? So at some point of time, the prevalent technology was what we now know as letterpress or block, where metal blocks were made. So that had a certain limitation of the sharpness or the how thin the lines or elements can go. But today we don't have any such constraints. This was the same time when two other universities, University of Mumbai and University of Madras, were also established. by the British Empire. And what I want you guys to pay attention to is some of the similarities between the original logo of University of Calcutta with the lion and the unicorn and the circular arrangement. And in these two, for universities of Mumbai and Madras, we are able to recognize the shape of a crest or a warrior's shield with the ribbon kind of a thing at the bottom. There is another fourth very old institution. We know it as IIT Roorkee now, but when it was established in 1847, it was established as the Thomason College of Civil Engineering. It's been around, so, and I was very fortunate to have got this particular slide which sort of showed their original college monogram with alphabets trying to come together. If you pay attention to this one. However, the sitting lion in a sitting posture is a very, very dominating element. The one on the right is what they are currently using, and it's very interesting to note that even though there is a gear wheel and then there are these other elements and the resemblance of the Ashoka Chakra in the center and then the name in Hindi and English, but the lion is still there. Are you able to notice this little lion? Okay. So no points no points for guessing the influences of these logos which were established way before our independence. Of course, I mean there is a certain so to say influence from the colonial era. The British thing, the lion is a very, very important motive in the British coat of arms, and the University of Cambridge still has a crest and 4 lions which are there. Like we use the lion capital in India now, right? Now let us look at what happened post-independence. Now this was a period which we are all aware in the early 50s into the decade of the early 60s. The then government gave a lot of emphasis in setting up institutions of higher education, and some of you guys may be graduates or your parents may have studied in such institutions like the IITs and the IIMs and all those. So let us look at how their logos were. No, when we look at the logo of the IIT Delhi on the left or IIT Bombay, let me just take you through these and then we'll have a conversation about how does it work. Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, quite a decorative and floral motif. If you just look at the motif and ignore the typography, don't be surprised if you are reminded of some ornamental decorations on some kind of carpets which are very popular in carpets or floor rugs popular in northern part of India. On the right is IIM Kozhikode, and then one really wonders, oh, it's an Indian Institute of Management, but what they have is a very generic open book, something which resembles a gear wheel, mechanical this thing, and then we have a bow and an arrow. Very interesting. Let's look at a few more. IIT Kharagpur, the gear wheel comes back, the open wheel comes back, and there's a tree which is growing out of the open book. IIT Roorkee, we've already seen. This is a color version. Okay. IIM Calcutta. Many of these institutes were established in the late 50s, early 60s. IIM Calcutta has a part gear wheel and part agricultural kind of an element, and there's a flower in the middle. BITS Pilani, the gear wheel is there, some abstract notion, maybe these are ions or molecules which are connecting, things like that. If we look at some of these non-technology kind of institutions, look at Delhi University, of course, I mean, seriously, is that an elephant? It is an elephant, right? Central universities and state universities were also established at that in that period, many. Yeah. So when we look at the Central University of Bihar, one assumes that, oh, there is some resemblance. Does it look like a banyan tree? Are they trying to make a connection with the land of Gautam Buddha? and then making a tangential connection with the seat of learning and wisdom. In some logos of that era, the connection with the visual elements is pretty head on. Like in the Central University of Kashmir, the chinar leaf is very clear and recognizable. But when we look at some of the younger universities or even the private universities like Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham University, we start noticing a lot of cultural motifs which start emerging. Like the outermost form, this light pink one, is almost like a open lotus viewed from the top, and then there is another lotus inside. There is a conch, which could be symbolic of expressing or announcement. There's a rising sun, or even when we look at the logo which the Acharya Nagarjuna University in Andhra Pradesh uses, we see a lot of these visual elements which have a correlationship with our own Indian mythology and symbol. However, there are also some which are trying to still relate to the ancient antiquity, in the sense like their logos are such which sort of try and project an image that, oh, we've been around for a longer time. So some resemblance of the crest or the shield, rather than a very specific colonial influence which we saw in the University of Madras or University of uh, Bombay kind of a thing. Uh, so when we look at these earlier institutions and their logos from about 5-6 decades ago, certain associative imagery is becoming very evident. There are motifs with cultural roots, our own religious beliefs. So the lotus as the seat of goddess Saraswati. No, it's not the seat. The seat is the swan. I'm sorry, my bad. But the lotus as a symbolic metaphor of learning, education, purity. We see some forms of the growing tree indicating growth. We still have some metaphors of the crest and the typography and the text in the embedded in the ribbon kind of a thing. Now these are all reminiscence of symbols which have been used for so long that they have acquired a certain association with the seal of authority or an education institution being a much larger umbrella. No? There are also other motifs which are very dominating, like the earthen lamp or the open book or a rising sun, and some of them are also we see evidence of some domain related elements, like if you look at the law university logo, we find the balance or the tarazu kind of a thing, and the gear wheel is very dominantly occurring in most institutions which are technology driven, in terms of their academics and curriculum. uh, let's now jump to what is the current scenario. What are the much younger institutions? How are they looking at things? Now it is very interesting to note that younger universities, especially in the private sector, or even with the public-private partnership, they do not have a legacy of being conducting or offering a course or a certain kind of programs for a longer time. But they are surely in a much more competitive scenario, and perhaps their revenue expenditure is also many times more than older, larger, established universities. So when we look at their logos, my understanding and observation is that they are still trying to project a certain subliminal or a certain hidden message that we've been around for a long time, and that is how we look at the re-emergence of some of these elements which are associated with older universities, like the crest or a shield. Now it's very interesting. Now when you look at this flame university, if you look at the orange element, it does look like the two horizontal strokes of the F, but the overall form just reminds you of a crest or a shield kind of a thing. Ramaiah University, even though it is a swan, but it is sort of enclosed in a shape which reminds you of the crest. Of course, colors, the way colors are used, it's a much more contemporary visual language, partly also because the technology of today's time allows the reproduction of the logo across a variety of mediums in multicolor applications, right? Many logos of younger universities are also very consciously having embedded narratives. The relationship with the metaphor is still there. Say, for example, Karnavati University, it is very obviously an image of a peacock, right? But the colors they have used is also symbolizing perhaps a rising sun, growth, certain warmth and energy and things like that. If we replace Karnavati University with another name, it could be, let us say something like some mithai ka dukan, or maybe a private entity which is into selling exotic saris or hand woven saris. The logo might still work, right? Hold on to this point. I'll come back to this when we talk about the perception and associations. The one on the right, Swarnim Gujarat Sports University, it's a very, very dynamic logo, right? It has a certain embedded action, and then these different colors, they also have a certain meaning. So we have seen evidence that the younger institutions are consciously trying to build a certain message about their core philosophy. One very interesting observation was, we have now 22 IIMs in our country, and likewise more than 20 IITs and things like that. So at one level, irrespective of whether the IIM Ahmedabad was established in 1960s and IIM Jammu or Sambalpur just 5-6 years ago, they all have a certain credibility of being a IIM. Now, within that crowd of so many different IIMs, they also aspire to stand out and project their own unique philosophy in their logos. IIM Jammu and IIM Sambalpur, I can speak very confidently about them because these are done by me and we have had long conversations. And IIM Jammu, the director was very clear, we want to project that our graduates are leaders in the global player. So that is how the metaphor of a flying eagle and all those kind of things came in. IIM Sambalpur on the other side was quite clear about some other core values of theirs, which were networking and a certain openness, things like that. And then we added another layer of how all these 22 IIMs into bracket institutions are known in the general public by their location. So can the logo also have a certain indication of the location? And the one from the IIM Sambalpur is also inspired from the very popular Ikat, Sambalpuri Ikat weaving. Just give me a second, something happened with my slides. Okay. In the recent times, we are also aware that the kind of visual information which we are bombarded with has made the world a more competitive place, and everybody, not just the commercial entities but also institutions, besides, more in the context of the institutions, besides having a certain high benchmark and credibility, which is because of their program and because of the kind of placements and the graduates, but they still want to be seen. They still want to be in the they still want to capture the eyeball share of people. Okay, oh, if I'm talking about IIM Ahmedabad, it is something like that. Or if I'm talking about IIT Bombay, it is something like that. So there has been this constant thing of legacy versus credibility. How long has the institution been around? The competition with so many more players coming into the market, and now we are also talking about universities from abroad entering the education ecosystem in the country, and also the need to stay relevant. So I'm going to share very quickly three very interesting incidents of attempts at redesign. Not many of them were accepted easily. Now, University of Warwick in UK It's a pretty young university in the sense that it was established in 1960s, 65 to be precise. But when we look at their original logo, it is still reminiscent of a certain antiquity and that legacy, the crest, the elements. Even in India, many of you would recall that many universities still have this kind of a visual language, where they'll have a crest, they'll divide it into four and place some elements. Maybe a nucleus atom wala thing, another thing of an open book. These are very popular images. Now, somewhere in between, they wanted to redesign, they wanted to have a more contemporary logo. And this one was done by Frank Bright and Abel, an agency called Frank Bright and Abel, at a very phenomenal cost. The buzz on the internet is that the university spent about £80,000 to get their logo and the entire system redesigned. But this wasn't very well accepted by the community, and that was what I was quite delighted when Anupa also shared that how she involved certain segments of the community at NCBS and the archives, and also listened to them before she, sort of finally proposed that logo. There are records of the student community protesting against this redesign, that these wedge kind of a W. They have this flat version also, and they also have a version with a gradient, that this does not look like a university logo. No, when we look up on their website, they're just using this W solid form, which is quite sharp, spiky. Reminds one of a mountaineering training institute, with just the Warwick. The third line, the University of Warwick, is not used everywhere. There was another example of the University of California, very old university, and this one was actually used for a year and then rolled back, again for similar reasons. It's a very controversial thing, but we have some interesting examples in our neighborhood also. Indian Institute of Science, a very, very recent, many of you would recall. Of course, the institute was established more than 100 years ago, but we have a record that this particular logo on the left was used somewhere around the mid 50s, 1950s, and later on. And in 2018, this new logo, the one in the center, was proposed. It was launched with a lot of pomp and fanfare, and it was designed by one of the leading design agencies in the country called Vyas Gyaneti Creative. They also did the Aditya Birla Group logo and all those kind of things. It's but obvious that this one also faced a lot of resistance. The inside story is that now the one in the center is being used as their logo for all external communication and things like that. But a more clean, refined, redesigned version of their original logo, which is there on the right hand side, is now being used as the seal on all official certifications, documentation, and things like that. Because some of these institutions have reached that level of credibility and reputation that people are not going to look at their advertising to seek admission into that, right? So that is where the logo and the branding plays a certain kind of role. In my personal neighborhood in Gujarat, we had something called the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, again established in the early 60s. They started off with the College of Architecture, perhaps one of the top 3 in the country. And then they went through a certain process of adding more programs in their basket, to a level that they became a university. Now, once they became a university and they had many more clarity about School of Architecture, School of Building Science and Technology, School of Interior Design, and things like that. Now, when that kind of entire, so to say, the mandate or the mission of an institution evolves, there is of course a requirement for their identity also to reflect how they have grown and how they stand in the current times, right? So the one on the right is their new logo, which is largely typography based. So this was a certain analysis of what is existing. Now the last part of my this thing is what do we understand? What sense do we make when we talk about the visual vocabulary of logos? What are the visual properties which define a certain logo that this seems to be a organizational or an institutional logo versus this seems to be the logo of a commercial establishment or a profit making kind of a product or a service. Now when I am saying this, please imagine the logos of Coca-Cola, Pepsi, FedEx, Colgate, and many of these commercial, even Vodafone. They may not be selling a product, but they are surely selling a service. So what we've also observed that the logos of institutions appear to be having a greater gravitas. They appear to be more mature, they appear to be less agitated or dynamic, so to say, kind of a thing in their visual form. Many of them we find eventually are enclosed in a certain form, so there is a certain completeness and unity of the form and shape in their logos. And what I have done and I have analyzed is that in the current scape, both the 50-60 year older institutions as well as the new ones which are coming in, there are 4 or 5 tracks in which they can fall. The first track is where in the logo of an institution there is a strong correlationship with the geographical landmark. So say for example the IIM Ahmedabad logo, the visual motif is actually an adaptation of a very popular monument from the mid 17th century in Ahmedabad. It is called the Siddhi Saeed Mosque. As a matter of fact, it's one of the oldest active mosques in this part of the country, and then they have adapted that. So there is a very strong relationship with that. This logo is of an organization which is in this particular city. When we look at IIT Jammu's logo, it's again a very recent thing, designed in 2017-18. One can very easily recognize the entire outline map of the state of Jammu, Kashmir, Leh, Ladakh. Now it's a different story because now they have become union territories, and the map of Jammu might be very different. On the right we have Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur, and Jodhpur is one of those cities where we still see these kind of structures, Jantar Mantar, like in Delhi, Jaipur and all. There are other manifestations also, like when we look at the Himachal Pradesh, Central University of Himachal Pradesh, they have tried to make quite a generic thing, and same with Doon University also, which is a state university. So there are mountains, there are rising sun and things like that. The Cluster University of Srinagar is also a very, very young university, and they have a very interesting backstory, because some universities are established, as Anupa was also saying, with the clarity and with the focus. Okay, this is what our mandate is, this is what we are going to do. In Jammu and Kashmir, it was a very different story, and the government realized that there are very few universities, and that is becoming sort of a roadblock in terms of delivering the education and the pedagogy system. So what they did was they looked at 5 colleges which have a certain credibility and reputation. All these 5 colleges are more than 90 years old. They brought all these 5 colleges together and established a cluster University of Srinagar. So that obviously helped them deliver a much more broader range of programs and things like that. So when we look at this geographical landmark, of course the saffron flower and the grid kind of a structure, the open book, but the saffron flower is very, very strong indicator of the geographical location. The second category in terms of the visual vocabulary is very obviously domain related, that what is the focus of this particular institution. So one on the left is the National Law University, which started off as the National Law School in Bangalore. The crest is of course there, but there is the map of India, an open book, but more importantly the balance, which is talking about justice, equality. Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, interestingly, has the gear wheel, which is a very, very dominating this thing, and then the open book and the lotus are sort of Indian motifs. Indian Institute of Forest Management, even though it falls under the category of a logo type, IIFM, but do notice that how the I and the F have been redesigned to form branches of the tree, right? And that's how they are perhaps trying to indicate the forest. So there are visual elements which are giving a certain clue as to what can be the domain in which this particular institution is focusing on. So we also have an Academy of Maritime Education and Training in Chennai. So obviously the wheel of a ship and the anchor, the Kamdhenu University in Gujarat, which is focusing on veterinary science. So they have all the three: the cow, the fish, the bird. So the land, the water, and the air. And Anand Agricultural University, although my personal opinions are that it's a very, very generic logo. This leaf could be anything. But by including the leaf, there is a very strong indication that we have got to do with plants. No? Moving on, the third group deals with historical and metaphorical references, and that is where an embedded narrative starts coming in. So Nalanda University, I am told that the shape and the motif inside a slightly organic, it's not a perfect circle, it's sort of an organic circle. This was a seal which was discovered by the archaeological department in the erstwhile Nalanda University. So they adapted the same and then started adding meaning to it. Maharaja Sayaji Rao University, MS University, Baroda, lotus, and within the lotus there seems to be a flame spreading knowledge, water, fluidity, all those kind of Indian motifs are embedded to form a certain metaphorical references. Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan, KVS, I am sure some of us would know graduates of the KVS. It's a very, very popular thing. So when they were completing 50 years, they designed a new logo. Of course, the tricolor is also rendered in the shape which looks like pages of an open book, and the rising sun, which looks like rays of the rising sun, can be interpreted in many ways. If you look at the horizontal part, it might appear like an open book, but it also appears like birds which are flying. Remember the albatross kind of a thing. So all these metaphorical meanings tend to get embedded in these logos. Cluster University of Jammu, similar to the Cluster University of Srinagar, if you would recall. But then what the hell is this peacock doing? Now there is a very, very interesting cultural activity which happens called Chow dance, which is very unique to the area of Jammu, where men dress up as peacocks and then whatever cultural this thing happens. So those kind of meanings are embedded. Raksha Shakti University, of course, they look at the pen is mightier than the sword, but the sword is also there. So there are still reminiscence of the older legacy of antiquity. Mahatma Gandhi University is in Kottayam. Of course, the charkha, but the charkha also has a earthen lamp as a metaphor of dispelling the darkness. And that's how they are relating it to knowledge, spreading the light of knowledge and things like that. The fourth category is what is abstract, sometimes abstract, very, very abstract, but a very contemporary visual language. Lovely University, lovely professional university, Punjab, one of the leading private universities in terms of their ranking, but one still wonders what their logo is trying to say. And I'm sure 20 years down the line, if they are able to maintain the benchmarks of their academic delivery, people will not bother about the logo. Ashoka University, of course, has gone a step further. It's a very distinct geometrical shape, talks about overlapping structures. It also creates a certain illusion of mobility, action. Now, there seems to be things which are emanating from the center and growing towards the periphery, right? So there are, of course, so to say, the concept behind the form. It's a good conversation starter. But it doesn't tell us what are their program focus. I mean, it doesn't tell us that Ashoka University focuses largely on humanities and liberal arts, right? And they're damn good at that. Similarly, Anant National University, uh, of course, it is a pyramid, it's a tetrahedron, it talks about nodes which are connecting at that level. Flame University and Swarnim Gujarat, we've already spoken about that. Of course, there is the fifth category where, uh, to my analysis, they are illustrative. There may or may not be a message, but the form or the shape of the logo is almost like an illustration where different elements come together to create a larger meaning. So one interesting example which I could dig up for you guys today's conversation was this Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University in Lucknow. There are many institutions on his name, like there are many institutions named after Mahatma Gandhi. But there are metaphors which are very directly related to his belief and the Buddhist way of thinking. So there's the Bodhi tree and elements of the stupa, but they're largely illustrative. The one on the right is a proposed logo for Birsa Munda Tribal University. Now, for the tribal community, the bow and arrow are very important cultural, so to say, artifacts. But the illustration of the person on whom the university is named is bang on in the center, and then there are motifs taken from the visual language of the indigenous communities. They're very illustrative. Uh, so that is the kind of visual vocabulary which I wanted to share with you guys in this conversation, and I think I have taken more than the time which was given to me. So I'll conclude here. Thank you so much for your patience. Uh, we can perhaps now move on to a more freewheely conversation. Venkat, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tarun. That was fantastic. It was a lovely overview of various logos. And Anupa, thanks again for the work that you've done. So that's it. I'm going to put a few links in the chat just so people can have a look. But this is when we're open to a much broader sort of Q&A from people, questions around the specifics from Tarun's conversation or from Anupa's. So you can use the chat. You can
just raise your hand, unmute yourself, and
I feel like this
be
point
more
we
happy
make everyone knows
to
what
get out of that default font of the chat window.
So yeah. But I just wanted to throw one thing out to both. I mean, I know this conversation was focused on visual language and logos in India, but I'm wondering, can either of you speak about, are there any variances if you go geographically in different parts of the world? Are there ways in which people approach logos? Is there something around that you have seen? In the same discipline, if you look in different geographies, does it make a difference?
That's very... Anupa, you have some thoughts on this?
I don't actually. I'm just thinking of no, nothing that I can think of. Like usually I feel all like at least in the contemporary state, like most of the exercises are based on like they figure out what are the values that the institution stands for and then build from there. Unless otherwise there is some heritage to build from, then they look into that. Like so that's essentially what I've noticed. Which I guess is the same even for Indian institutions when they read that like apart from a few odd cases.
But I think, Venkat, you have hit on a very, very potential doctoral research project. That even if you focus on academic logos of academic institutions, what is, so to say, the visual scape across the world? There are, I don't have the exact figure, but half of the world was at some point of time colonized by either the Britishers or by the French or by the Portuguese. And we do have evidences of those continuity in architectural elements. Now it would be worthwhile to investigate whether those kind of visual elements and associations have also crept into identity design or logo designs of institutions.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, one thing that occurred to me when I was looking at the visual designs of many of the universities, the idea of the crest that you'd shown or the sort of a shield.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the word is. I'm sure the designers in this group can say, the way you have the symbol of save on a digital platform is still the floppy disk. So there is this sort of, using the things that people are familiar with. You still use a film camera to talk about video. And I forget there was a word for this about using effectively.
Skeuomorphism. Are
What
you
is it?
looking for the skeuomorphism,
Yes,
which is
thank you.
basically you just look for like whatever resembles real life thing, you just mimic that into the digital space, even though it's not required.
Right.
Yeah.
So is that an element in logos, especially for institutions that I'm just curious to know, when we think of Lunge, I mean, the idea of the shield, which is, or the idea of, or of the insignia also. I'm just curious to know, I mean, of course, Anupa, you and I have spoken about the insignia and such, but I'm wondering if that is a theme that is pushed in logos to symbolize a connection to the past and going forward. I'm just wondering.
See,
So I feel
yes, Anupa, please.
No, I just wanted to say one thing. I think it has broadly to do with the fact that it depends on what people are familiar with. So even with, say, for example, the save icon, for the longest time, a lot of people recognized it as the floppy disk, like the people of the generation who used to use those floppy disks. It's so I like even when I'm looking at the digital design use these days, like I had to fairly recently like audit the design for an application, and they were using the save the floppy disk as the symbol. And but the thing is, I feel for one generation it's a recognizable form. For another generation, they've seen the floppy disk symbol, they don't know where it's come from, but they know it means save. So then you continue the tradition of using that same thing because it's just familiar and it associates to this particular thing. I guess it's the same applies even with the shield for institutions or any of those motives that are used typically. Tarun, you were
See,
saying.
it actually operates at a very, very larger level, and Anupa has, shared some very appropriate points. We all seek comfort in familiarity. And this is such a common, so to say, cognitive decision which we take subconsciously often, whether we look at the choices which we make in terms of the clothes which we buy for ourselves, or if we could recall some conversations with our family members who are, older, maybe our parents, maybe our grandparents, and sometimes, they make a comment on our choices of dressing up or shoes or colors or stationery or, anything, or even food. Uh, Human beings have a tendency to find solace or comfort in familiarity. Now the big question is, how does familiarity develops? If something is around for a certain period of time or a longer period of time, we tend to accept that this particular visual or this particular action denotes this kind of a thing. So that acceptance is something which, so to say, um, it gets marinated, over a certain period of time of consistent use. And that's what I was also saying, if you could recall the logo of lovely professional university, one of the richest universities in the country, private, higher than usual fees, but many of their programs are very well sought after. Their graduates are also doing very well. Uh, 20 years down the line, if they are able to maintain their academic benchmarks, people will not bother about their logo, right? Similarly, when University of Warwick or University of California and Berkeley, when they attempted to redesign their logos, they were huge. I mean, there were petitions were filed in the legal system that we do not want this logo kind of a thing, because there is a certain strong association and a certain comfort. Okay, this is what it is. I can share another example from a very, very recent project which I am working for the Government of India. I cannot reveal many details, but one of the important points in the initial conversations when we were trying to articulate the brief, they said, okay, our activity, what we do and how we are different from other government departments, that is very simple, that is very obvious. You will obviously incorporate it in the logo, but we want our logo to be authoritative. And despite, I mean, we've been working on it now for almost now 6.5, 7 months, couple of round of meetings with this group, with that group, with this officer, with that kind of a very senior officials. Finally, you know what made them accept a logo with a certain sense of authority? The inclusion of the lion capital. Now, if we turn around and look at especially logos of government organizations, whether it is the Reserve Bank of India or whether it is, how do we perceive, oh, this is authentic, this has a certain authority in the Indian context, whether it is the currency note or whatever, we see the seal of the Government of India, the lion capital, those 3 lions, right? Of course, the 4th one is hidden. Why? Because we look at elements which give us a subconscious degree of comfort. Oh, okay, I can trust this. I guess the same thing operates when we look at organizations, logos of academic institutions or higher education institutions versus logos of private schools. Maybe even if we look at K-12 schools, some of them have, or logos of schools which are catering to the kindergarten kind of a thing. Their logos obviously would be very playful, right? Illustrative to an extent. The typography is also playful. Now there one is looking at, as we were discussing earlier also, what are the values and what are the kind of narratives which we want to tell to our audience. So that associative meaning making or sense making, it's a very, very subconscious process and it happens with a consistent. That's why we always say that logos are often designed by the designer, but the decisions are taken by the decision makers who are active at that point of period in the history of that organization. So that decision is taken. What actually works is how that logo is consistently used over a period of time. Second, how the actual interactions and performance of the organization, it could be a commercial organization also, in terms of the values which they are promising and their actions are fulfilling those things. Let's just take an example of the mobile service industry, right? Irrespective of my or anybody else's favorite logo of mobile network providers, we don't give a damn to the logo if we are facing too many call drops. So the services have to also live up to the kind of messages which we want to give through the visual identity and branding exercises, you know. Then those associations become associations for lifetime.
Thanks, Tarun. Thank you.
Something popping up in the chat box.
Yeah, feel free to put questions, guys. Otherwise,
Okay.
I'm just going to keep peppering these guys with questions. And you're also welcome to critique logos. You know, there's, you know, we have thick skins. But I mean, so one more thing around this, I was thinking. I'm an etymology geek for the ones who know me, so I didn't quite realize that logo is effectively a short for logogram, which is a way of thinking of an image for a word. But I'm wondering as we go forward, if is there a way to go beyond? I don't know if you want to sort of speculate. If this is all around identity or sort of, you know, building identities. When you see institutions that change their logos, for instance, I suppose there's an attempt to try to sort of redefine and keep with a certain time. So there are 2 questions here. One is that there is a certain, I don't know if minimalism is the word. I don't know. I'll have to ask you. I mean, in terms of the nature of logos today, say compared to 100 years ago. I don't know if that's the word to use, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it to see whether there will be ways in which that will transform again going forward, as you might imagine. That's one. But second, is, as you talked about lovely professional universities, your logo, Tarun, to say that, if a university does well, then the logo basically rises up to the challenge in a way that, people identify with the logo because it's the brand is now backing it well. But if you go forward, is there a point when the symbols, does the symbol still have to make sense? Do people do design changes because they feel like it now needs to make sense, rather than saying it is aesthetically pleasing and let's just leave it at that? Is that is the meaning of the logo so critical at a point in the future that people say that, but it doesn't make sense, we have to change it? What's an elephant doing in our logo anymore, sort of thing?
I think it happens like over a period of time it can happen, but at the end of the day, a lot of logos are created for for existing for a very long period of time, which is why I think historically the logos that have survived are the ones who've been very restrained with the forms that they've used. You could call it minimalism, but I'm not entirely sure whether that it is minimalism. But I guess like if you can take any of the older, like something like even IBM, for example, like it's such a simple, straightforward logo. Like even now they use that logo, and I think that logo was designed in the 70s. So there are, at the end of the day, I think it's about how functional you want the logo to be. If you don't want it to last for more than a few years, then you add a lot of layer to it, and I guess like it need not be memorable in that sense. But if you want it to really like test against time, like you make sure that the forms are such that it can work across various platforms on various sizes. Like it on a functional level it really works, so it's recognizable no matter what happens. So I think that's probably how you would evaluate it. Tarun, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what you are saying. When we look at the larger historical perspective, the logos as we know today are a very very recent entity. Post the industrial revolution, when the supply demand ratio started changing, that gave birth to advertising, and that was the time when the need was felt to have an identity of my commercial activities also. Whether I am a hairdresser or whether I am into ironing clothes or metal forging, making weapons, making chairs, furniture, whatever. So imagine that scenario of 300 years ago when people wanted to be known according to their trade. Even in India, we have had a legacy of surnames being associated with the kind of activity or the trade. You know, in some regions it is very very obvious. Like in the western part of the country, we have surnames like Batliwala and Daruwala and Mithaiwala and all those kind of things in some communities. Uh, when the need for distinguishing okay, for this particular activity I need to look at this kind of a mark on the door of the shop or the facade and things like that. That gave rise to starting to have trademarks, word marks, logo types. So when it happened initially, I'm trying to explain things in a very very simpler and in a nutshell. Initial identities and logos were all word marks. So W. Smith and Sons, they'll have a WS, but drawn in a unique way, more like an emblem. Now, that time the technology was not, they did not have four color printing or offset printing the way we have now. So the most direct application was a seal or a rubber stamp kind of a thing or a wooden block, or maybe they would hand paint it on the facade of their commercial establishment. Now, as reproduction technology started improving, the details in the visual elements also started getting refined. So turn of the 18th 19th century, we see logos which started getting visual elements also started coming in, the national emblem started coming in. That's why we see a lot of these European and British organizations, government organizations, and some to some degree academic institutions. There's a recurring motive of the crest and the cross and the lion. from the UK heraldry. In India, at one level, the lion capital denotes a certain government establishment authority, but when we look at the other things, we see a lot of religious motives also. We see a lot of those cultural motives which we see. So, say for example, if we would look at the logo of Aligarh Muslim University, there's a very distinct palm and a crescent, right? In many universities, we find the lotus in various manifestations, either from the side view or from the top view, the 8-petaled lotus and things like that. No? Now, these roots are all in our cultural beliefs as well. The third major shift which influenced the visual language was with the coming of the digital screen and the computers and the WWW, which allowed use of multiple colors in the logos, right? So gradients started coming in, colors started coming in, and that was also backed up with advancement in print technology. Nowadays, it's very commonplace to have 4-color logos, like even NCBS also. If we look at your logo, I cannot imagine screen printing it, but offset printing and digital printing is now very affordable. So now the visual language is also that designers are not constrained by the fact that my logo is going to be reproduced using metal blocks, so I can't have very fine lines or I can't have gradients. So now we are actually free from those kind of technology or reproduction constraints, and that is how the visual language has also expanded. So those are some of the kind of influences which we have distinctly seen. That the elements, of course, we've covered that earlier. Elements which make a much stronger and a much quicker association. That is sort of over a period of time, those associations start becoming stronger. Like you took an example of the floppy disk and the save icon. In the same series, there are many more examples which we see. Attachment still uses a gem clip kind of a thing. Inbox or email still uses an envelope, which is a distinct diamond wala envelope, with the rectangle and the cross going across, So there are many, these are very strong associative imagery which have now acquired a different meaning. And in the coming 50 years or 100 years, it may acquire a different meaning. Like say for example, I don't know whether we should call it a symbol, but it is a symbolic message. Some people may call it an icon also, which we see on food products, the veg and non-veg thing. Doesn't mean anything. I mean, everything which is green in color and is edible does not make it vegetarian, right? Or vice versa. But it has been consistently used that over a period of time, we have all accepted that the green dot with a green square border means this is a vegetarian food. Now they are also coming up with another icon for vegan food, especially in the context of this thing, So acquired meanings and acquired association is also something which is an important element of when we develop anything new. People, and that's always open to interpretation, and the more stories, the more interesting it will be, because when people are going to talk about your logo, which means they are thinking about you as an organization, right? So people will make all kind of connections. 2 connections you guys have made. It's about the creator and the archivist and the person who is accessing the archives, right? That and is actually a connector, right? So that is your starting point. Now, as people start getting familiarized with it, they'll have more interpretations. The idea of a logo is to remain in the mind of people, and by that process, continue to remind them of the organization and the activities of that organization.
Thanks, Tarun. Thanks so much. We're almost out of time, but let's just squeeze in because there are a couple of questions. Ananta Krishna had your hand up. If you're able to unmute, you could go ahead and speak. I'm not sure if you still had a question.
Hi, this is Ananta here.
Hi, Ananta.
See, the thing is, it's a nice presentation actually, both for Anupa and Tarun. what I
Thank
was
you.
looking at is the people who have the cultural values, whether the institutions or the departments or the companies, whoever it is, they don't want to change the logos at any point of time. They want to keep it. If the person or is like a head of the institutions of the companies or institutes or whatever it is, if he has a dynamism, one is the institute as well as the head of the institutes. If they have a dynamism in their mindset or the creativity, they tend to change their what you call the logos depending on the expansion of their business or expansion of their wings towards the global and things like that. No, they try to change it. It's like if you look at the University of Mysore, because I come from the different in the Karnataka place where I can look into, they didn't want to change the logo at any point of time. And if you look at the logo, the whatever the information which is inside the logo is, though it look like a crest, it is not a crest. And lot of animals which they have used is a mythological animals which has a what you call a lion and a elephant together. They have used that one and it is there from a long time. It's like a 1900 it is there, and now also they have not changed at all. The color of the emblem, the shape of the emblem, whatever it is the same. So it is always a cultural value is one end, and the dynamism and creativity of the company itself or the institute itself. If the institute is spreading across the globe or verticals and things like that, they tend to change their logos. That's what I think.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Is there
Uh,
any other question or?
I think that was just a broader comment. Yeah. No, that's
Okay.
Okay.
fine.
no,
Okay.
it is not. It's
Yeah.
not a comment
I just have.
actually. No, it is not a comment. See,
Yeah.
what I put it across is whether the person can look in these angles to see how the evolution of logo change or something like that in the institution happen.
Mm,
It's actually, Anupa, if I may,
yeah. Yeah. Please.
uh, what Sharma ji has shared, I mean, it's a conversation, it's not a question answer kind of a thing. But you are very correct that often change is driven by decision makers, right? Uh, so sometimes we also get a lot of queries where we do all our analysis, what Anupa had mentioned about investigation. No, what was the word you had used? The first one was uh,
First one was investigation. Then I.
investigation, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it has also happened with me that after that entire thing of investigation, understanding the requirements, understanding and all those things, we've gone back to the client and said, boss, you don't need to change your logo. All you need to have a much more cleaner, sharper uh, artwork,
Hmm.
or maybe have a more clarity in terms of how do we create a system that your logo is now consistently used. So sometimes we do not just touch the logo, we just clean it up, but we create a system for them and their employees that the logo is henceforth used consistently without any distortion. Sometimes we also help them re-articulating the story. See, how will people get to know about their logo or anybody's logo, right? It is around there. But today the world is all about stories. People tend to believe the stories which we feed to them. So, University of Mysore, inside that crest kind of a shape, there is a bird, mythical bird which has two heads, right? It's the same bird which we also see on the logo of, I think, Karnataka State Transport Corporation. So there is some relationship with the geographical land. But we need to start telling people those stories. What does it mean? Or maybe re-articulate those stories and things like that. But you are very correct. Change is often driven by the people at the top. I was working on a logo where the initiator, the director of that organization, was sent to Africa on deputation. IS officers, so they tend to move on. New director was not appointed for almost 1.5 years. Caretaker director was not interested. Project went on, went on, went on. The government at the center changed. And changed in the sense, it's not just the ministers changed, the ruling party changed. When the ruling party changed, the new directors were brought in place and dynamic guys. So he was saying, oh, why are all these projects pending? The file was brought out. So after 3 years, I was summoned. Okay, what is the status? We said, this is the status. And then they said, no, we want to complete this project. We've started this logo, so we have to do it. Ministers changed, they changed the brief, you know. So for us, it was a completely different project what we started working on 3 years ago. So sometimes those kind of things also happen. But yes, the decision makers have to take a decision, because changing a logo, revamping, revising it, refining it, whatever activity, it's an investment. I won't say it's an expenditure, it's an investment. You know?
Okay, we are almost out of time, but I see Hemal has his hand up, so it's going to be quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay. So very interesting conversation and presentation and everything. All of that. But I have a very elementary and a very basic. I mean, almost a silly question to ask. So I'm an amateur designer myself. So I do logos for friends and all that. The thing is like this. What happens is that, so if there's a brief given to me, I try to match my logo to that brief and the message that they want to send out, and something that represents their kind of thinking. But sometimes I have like a shorter brief or almost a no brief at all, and many times it becomes more convenient to make a logo that just looks brilliant, It's the other way around. Sometimes I make a logo that looks great. Yes, and then just try to connect it with the brief somehow or the other, So I just wanted to know if that is legitimate. Is it allowed, or is cheating, or what the thoughts are on that actually, Yeah.
I think if you ever get a no brief situation, like just keep asking people 100 questions till you get yourself a brief. And I think that's what you should do, because the thing is, then you're just like doing something in the dark, and whatever you make may or may not work, which is not ideal. You've also spent a lot of time on it. So until you get a brief, you just ask, because I also understand a lot of times clients find it very hard to write a brief, and that's quite common, and it's perfectly fine, because it's no one's taught to write a brief, and it's our job as a designer to extract like what their requirement is. So you just have to, if it's a business, then you read everything possible about that business, and like and about the management running the business, and constantly keep asking them questions about why they're doing what they're doing, who it is for, like extract every possible information, and you will find yourself a brief.
I think I have the answer now. Thank you so much.
Very well said, Anupa. Very well said. I really appreciate. But things sometimes operate very differently. I have done some pro bono work, and there have been some good friends. They're still good friends who waited for many years. Ki nahi, Tarun, you only make my logo. But we were very clear from the beginning that it's a pro bono work. So my condition was, I'll not give you any options. I'll give you one logo, you take it or don't take it, right? But if you expect me to go through the whole process and all that tam-jam, presentation, mock-ups, this thing, that thing, then it's obviously got to be an investment, right? But I agree fully with Anupa. Many people, many senior people, CEOs, people who have invested crores of rupees in their ventures, they don't often know what they are looking for till the time we don't show it to them. So a part of my briefing process, it's a very personal story which I am sharing. My briefing interactions with the client is hardly 20% words and 80% visuals. I have shown them have had conversations, visual conversations with them with sketches and doodles on tracing papers. Are you looking at something like this? Are you sure about something like this? Or sometimes, we also take other references. Okay, you tell us what your preferences are. So meaning making is the easier part. Often the conflicts arise when it comes to visual preferences, So some people do not like a certain color, but then it's our responsibility as designers to take them through and convince them that why this particular color is relevant to the kind of business which you are doing and relevant and significant to the kind of story which you want to narrate about you through your logo, the values.
Kind of the logic of the whole thing, actually.
Yes, the rationale and the logic.
Yeah, rationale.
Yeah. That's how it happens.
I almost feel like an intruder in as a client in a conversation of designers. So I'm just going to stay out of this one. But I completely hear what you're saying. But we're really out of time. I want to keep the conversation going. So what I'll do is I'll at least just sort of formally close this by thanking Tarun, thanking Anupa, and thanking the audience who've been here. And we are super delighted, Anupa, with the logo, and we look forward to using it. And of course,
Thanks so much.
the burden is on us now to live up to the logo, of course. So, that's something that we'll have to see in the years,
You've
decades.
been living it already.
So let's see how it goes. But for now, thanks everyone. I'm just going to stop the recording. You're obviously welcome to come continue hanging out. With that, so thanks so much again, everyone.
Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.